Thank you all for coming tonight. Is this on? You're okay? Meg Groeling is our speaker tonight, and she's going to talk to us about her book, The Aftermath of Battle. Meg retired in June 2017 from teaching, and her undergraduate degree in liberal studies with a minor in American history was from Cal State University, Long Beach. She received her master's degree in military history with a Civil War emphasis in 2016 from American Public University. She has also written First Fallen, the life of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, the North's first Civil War hero, and it was the only biography written about Ellsworth since 1960. And if you have good memories, you'll recall that she spoke to us on one of our virtual meetings last year. So tonight she's going to speak to us about her other book, and we welcome Meg Groeling. Thank you.
All right. Hello, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I have more hair than I did last time I saw you, so that's a good thing. The series, let me see if I can get this all figured out. Okay, the series that Emerging Civil War did, Savas Beatty publishes it. And Emerging Civil War is a blog, and it began in 2011. And I found them on the internet in 2011 and said, gee, do you have like someone who could write about Elmer Ellsworth? And they said, well, just write something, we'll let you know. And I've written for them ever since, and they're just terrific people. And Savas Beatty, who is a California publisher, worked with Chris Mikowski to put together the Emerging Civil War series. And all the books have a very similar look. They were designed to be a price point book to be sold at battlefields and in gift shops. But it turned into a lot more. There's, it seems like hundreds of these now, and they all get, the sales are all excellent. Most of the Emerging Civil War series, though, deal with one subject, a battle, even one day of a battle. And my book, Aftermath, is different in that it deals with one subject, but that subject is looked at from many different positions. I was not the original choice to write the book, but after whoever it was that they chose, I think her last name is Thompson, which gave a lot of confusion because at that point my last name is also Thompson, but I'm not her. They just didn't like what she had done. And Chris and I talked about it and said, well, you know, how did all this start? You know, give me the background on it. And most of the gentlemen who at that time anyway made up Emerging Civil War are or have been park rangers or battlefield guides, volunteers at Civil War sites, and they all agreed that the universal question asked by those who visit places like that is, what did they do with all the bodies? And Aftermath was created to answer that question. The problem is let me explain. It was designed chronologically from the first officer death, Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, to the death of the last surviving Civil War veteran. And not every battle is a topic of discussion, because to do it that way would simply be to tell the same story again and again. Pain, anguish, death, destruction. Oh, and then there's another battle, and gee, the same thing happened. I looked for points where specifically different things took place. Things that were not very well known, or there had been a mystery about them, folk tales about things, or maybe science had evolved to help solve a problem, solve one of those mysteries. Illness and injury were responsible for most of the suffering in the Civil War, and approximately 3 times as many soldiers died from illness as from wounds. Many died in camp, not in battle. Let's see if I can get this to happen. Okay. One of the greatest legacies of the Civil War is how soldiers were treated after being wounded in action. In all honesty, prior to the American Civil War and this gentleman, Dr. Jonathan Letterman, it was sort of, they either went out in a group or got a wagon and picked up every dead and dying man until the wagon was full and turned around and went back. And sent out another one and just, worked their way down the battlefield. Dr. Jonathan Letterman didn't see things that way. He was George McClellan's medical director from July 1862 to December 1863. And he had a plan for battlefield triage. Battlefield triage, even today, is how the wounded were identified, transported, and treated from where they were wounded to first small field hospitals, get on to larger military hospitals, and from there to the hospitals in the big cities like Richmond and Washington. And it's the very same thing we do today. It has not changed. Very few changes have been made. And believe it or not, Dr. Jonathan Letterman was the first to have come up with this idea. I should tell you, one of the places we drive by on our way down from Hollister is Fort Tejon. And a million years ago, I think it was like the first Civil War, I reenacted, like I'm sure many of you did, at Fort Tejon. And when I was doing my master's thesis, I did it on Letterman, and specifically on amputations, and how things have changed, how things have stayed the same. I'll go into that later in the lecture. But I did not realize until I started reading about Jonathan Letterman that prior to his going back east to work with McClellan, Letterman was stationed at Fort Tejon. He was stationed there for 2 years. There is not one thing at that fort that identifies Dr. Jonathan Letterman as having served there for 2 years. And I've written letters and written emails and everything else, and I keep thinking, do I have to die and just will somebody some money to put a statue of the guy? I mean, can't they at least give one of those big cutouts? It's got to be something. But anytime you have the opportunity, you might mention that that's something that really needs to be addressed. If the Letterman Hospital in San Francisco, the Letterman building could keep the same name in honor of Jonathan Letterman after it was given over to making movies, then I think the least we can do is have information about Letterman and the changes he made at Fort Tejon. It's right in our backyard, and as one of the earlier gentlemen said, California had a lot more to do with the Civil War than you think. Many officers on both sides were called from duty in California to go serve in the Civil War, or resign and go do duty in the Civil War. Anyway, the battlefield evacuation plans, an established chain of care, and the results, which of course is saving lives, are all based on Dr. Letterman's insightful understanding of what is due any common soldier when he signs up, nowadays he or she, to die for his or her country. Horses and mules died by the hundreds of thousands, unwitting casualties of battle. Taps was played over human remains for the first time during the Civil War. Embedded and photojournalism began with Matthew Brady. Embalming and the safe transport of remains began with the Civil War as well. The problem of what to do with all the bodies gives us the National Cemetery movement. From Arlington to Andersonville, and lately where we are, the Monterey has finally opened a Vietnam Veterans Cemetery, and it's part of the National Cemetery chain. So. Well, finally, the veterans died, and the number of 620,000 casualties, sure some of you remember that from high school, lasted for over 100 years until a college professor decided to think outside the box and began a recounting of the Civil War dead. And currently, using modern methods, currently we're at 750,000 and rising. The first of all is Colonel Elmer Ellsworth. He died on May 24th in 1861 before Bull Run, and he died as the colonel of the 11th New York Fire Zouaves. But prior to that time, he had been a very good friend of Abraham Lincoln, who noticed him when he did a 20-city tour of the U.S. Zouave cadets, and went over 20 cities in the Northeast, sort of drumming up patriotic support for militias, which had fallen into disarray by then, and proving his U.S. Zouave cadets could do the Crimean Zouave drill just as well as the originals. And he was very well known. Every time the U.S. Zouave cadets came to a city, it was like a rock star had shown up, and everybody was there, and the girls were all, oh, you know. And so when he finished that, he decided he would go to Springfield. He was asked to study law with Abraham Lincoln. And in the middle of the law study, well, it wasn't really in the middle of these law studies, he did pass the bar. But while he was in Springfield, he had been asked by Lincoln to go to Washington, D.C. And he was living in the Marshall House and got very ill. And his friends John Hay and George Nicolay came to find out what was going on. And they realized he had come down with the measles. Now, then as now, measles for an adult male especially, is a very dangerous disease. But in fact, Elmer got them from the Lincoln boys who also had the measles. So it was during his recovery from that Lincoln had called, Sumter was fired on, and Lincoln had called for troops, and Ellsworth rose from his bed, went to Lincoln, and said, you know, give me a note to Horace Greeley, and I'll come back with a regiment. And that's exactly what happened. The 11th New York Fire Zouaves were raised in 2 days and back in Washington in almost no time at all. They were sent to occupy Alexandria. It was a military occupation. Alexandria was under martial law at the time they were there, so people think he just broke into the hotel and stole the flag. It wasn't it at all. The city was under military occupation because it was so close to Washington that Washington had agreed, it sounds like George Washington did it, the Congress agreed to not ever fire on Alexandria and to support hospitals and for both Union and Confederate, and make sure that Alexandria was safe as long as they would agree to be under martial law. Anyway, Ellsworth and his group go through. He has a small group of men with him, and he gets to the Marshall House. And I don't know if I've got a picture of that. Nope, it was the Sultan Blue. We'll go back this way. And there's a huge Confederate flag, stars and bars, on top of the Marshall House. Ellsworth goes up and takes it down, and in coming back down through the 3 floors of the Marshall House, James Jackson, the proprietor of the Marshall House, shoots Elmer Ellsworth and kills him instantly. This is a picture, it happens to be the cover of my book, but he is shot instantly and killed. And national mourning began in Washington. The Lincolns came to the Naval Yard to see the body and make sure it was their friend Elmer. They provided the green room for him to lie in state. Then he went by train to New York City, where he lay in state at the Capitol and then at the Astor Hotel, and then by steamboat up the Hudson to Mechanicville in upstate New York, where he was laid to rest in the place that he's buried now. The reason that Ellsworth, well, there are lots of reasons Ellsworth's important, but one of the ones is that it was truly a national celebration of mourning for one man. And this is the last time that's going to happen. But everybody knew who Ellsworth, in the North anyway, everybody knew who Ellsworth was. Everybody was very upset about his death. Even Robert E. Lee opined as to what he thought might have happened had Ellsworth lived. So it was really, really a big deal. So Ellsworth is the first to fall in the American Civil War. We already talked about All for the Union, and one of the other characters to come out of Ken Burns' film is Union Major Sullivan Ballou. And he had a particularly terrible personal aftermath. He's best known for being one of the most romantic men in the Union Army, and wrote a terribly wonderful letter to Dear Sarah, to his wife, that was read in Ken Burns' Civil War. He was not a West Point graduate at all. He was a political general. Well, he was a major, wasn't a general. A self-made man, a lawyer, a politician in Rhode Island, and he helped collect troops for the 2nd Rhode Island and led them at First Bull Run. And he died early in the morning fighting at a fence near the Stone House. He was injured there and died 8 days later on July 29, 1861. He was in the same hospital, which was Sudley Church, as Colonel John Slocum, who had died a few days earlier. Here's where his aftermath gets, it's hard to say worse than death, but it gets worse than death. There were not, as we know, no one was prepared for the Civil War. And one of the ways that they weren't prepared was they didn't have enough coffins, So they would get the best coffins they could and send them to the battlefield at Bull Run. And the better coffins were always given to the higher ranking officers. So they were out of good coffins. And poor Colonel John Slocum got buried in a pine box. But later, a few days later, when Sullivan Ballou died, he was buried in an officer's coffin. William Sprague, the governor of Rhode Island, who was also at the Battle of First Bull Run, comes that winter, to see how many of the Rhode Island soldiers he could unearth and get identified and get them back to Rhode Island. He was one of many state governors who were trying to get their men back, I guess you'd say. And asked an enslaved little girl where where things might be, where some of the burial sites have been. And she pointed out one near Sudley Creek, and as they kind of dug around in the creek, they found shirts and blankets, and they found a skeleton with no head and only one leg. Well, Ballou had lost a leg, and that was how they identified that as Sullivan Ballou's skeleton. From July to March, he lay buried until he was dug up by the 21st Georgia, who were not even in the battle. They were just there to oversee the battlefield for the Confederacy. They hadn't been in the battle. They were poorly led. There was little unit cohesion. They had no mission. They were just a bunch of young guys who were in a place they didn't want to be, doing things they didn't want to do. The liquor was plentiful, and they got themselves up to mischief. But it got sorted out, and even though they never found Sullivan Ballou's head, Ballou and Slocum were returned to Rhode Island and buried on March 31st in 1862. And now Sullivan Ballou rests next to him in Swan Point Cemetery in Providence, Rhode Island. Shiloh is one of those interesting aftermaths. You know the story, and that it took place, there was a day of battle, a horrible rainstorm, and another day of battle. Battle is considered won when one army leaves the field to its opponent. The problem with this is that the winning army has to clean the battlefield, which is a difficult and unpleasant job, as you might imagine. The Battle of Shiloh took place on April 6th and 7th, so the dead and the injured were left on the battlefield overnight in driving rain. It was a nightmare for everyone concerned. Feral pigs could be heard all over the field, munching away on dead men and on those not quite dead, apparently. Night-long bombardment from Grant's artillery stationed in the river area, plus lightning and thunder, sent flashes of light, loud explosive noises across that field of misery. Throughout the night, a phenomenon was noticed. Many soldiers who were wounded had a mysterious blue-green glow emanating from their open wounds. This was noted, and it was also realized that the men whose wounds had glowed the brightest ended up with the highest rate of recovery. The phenomenon, which was not only seen at Shiloh first, but seen in other places, including Gettysburg, became known as Angel's Glow, and it became part of the mythology of the Civil War. It was supernatural force, as it were. And it wasn't until 2001 that the mystery was solved. Now, looking out on this field of lovely faces, I would venture to say some of you have shepherded a young man or a young woman through the high school, what would you call it, coming of age, known as the science fair, Yeah, I mean, you read the thing, and you don't know what it says, the kid doesn't want to do it, and some of you may, even as grandparents, have, helped out with that. So this is a science fair story, and since I taught middle school for a while, and this really got my heart. Anyway, it was solved by two high school students who were Civil War buffs. 17-year-old Bill Martin was visiting Shiloh with his family, and he heard about the strange glow, angel glow. His mother, talk about fortuitous, just happened to be a microbiologist at the United States Department of Agriculture Agricultural Research Service. She had studied luminescent bacteria, and Martin wondered if similar bacteria might have been at work in Shiloh. And he and his friend John Curtis researched Photohabdus luminescens, a type of bacteria that lives in the guts of parasitic nematodes. So first the nematodes have to get you, and those nematodes have to have Photohabdus luminescens inside them. All right. Oops, sorry. His mother kind of oversaw his work, but they did their research, and when the nematodes vomited up the glowing bacteria, Photohabdus luminescens kills the other microbes living in the nematode's host, which is the victim. Now normally, Photohabdus luminescens couldn't live in the human body since it dies at human body temperature. But Martin and Curtis studied the historical records and the conditions in Shiloh and realized that the nighttime temperatures were low enough for the soldiers to develop hypothermia, allowing the bacteria to thrive in their bodies, killing off competing bacteria, and probably saving the lives of their human hosts. For solving this decades-old mystery, Curtis and Martin won first place at the 2001 Intel International Science and Engineering Fair. Yeah! So this is one where you probably heard the stories. Legend has it, that the bugle call taps was found by a Union Army captain. He heard a pitiful crying for water on the battlefield of what will become known as the 5 Days Battle near Berkeley Plantation in Virginia. The captain took a lantern out to find that soldier. When he finally located the boy, he realized it was his own son who had joined the Confederacy. He dragged his son back to camp, but the young man died later that night. As the distraught father searched his son's clothing, he found the notes to a bugle call written on a scrap of paper. Unable to arrange a proper burial for his son, he finally found a bugler who would sound those notes above the coffined remains of his child, and the rest, as they say, is history. Except, of course, none of this is true. It was a vignette written for Ripley's Believe It or Not and televised in 1949. In my opinion, the true story is much more interesting. Union General Dan Butterfield wrote bugle calls for his troops to distinguish the calls his men were to obey. He usually wrote a series of notes that came before the actual bugle call, so that when his men heard that series of notes, they realized, okay, the next one's for us, so tell us what to do. And during the encampment of the Army of the Potomac on the grounds of Berkeley Plantation, at least they had the place right, on the Virginia Peninsula, General Butterfield decided to try out a new bugle call for lights out. Butterfield's bugler, and if you read Civil War history kind of en masse, indiscriminately, this is one of the names that shows up every so often. He just appears in places. So probably the name sounds familiar. Oliver Norton was Butterfield's bugler. He practiced what Butterfield had written, and finally he debuted the call during the time of the 5 days battle. Within hours, that call had spread around the entire encamped army, and soon it was picked up by the Confederate buglers as well. And playing taps at funerals dates from this time, as it is a much shorter piece than those previously used, and it only requires one musician. Because often, if you're burying people in between battles, time and music men were in short supply. Oops. There we go. That's Dan Butterfield, one of my favorites. All right, the dead of Antietam. I'm going to also take a wild guess and say that probably if you weren't serving in Vietnam, you were watching the news and seeing actual war on your television for the first time in your life, just as I was, and how your life is forever changed by that. The Battle of Antietam and its pictures, the picture gallery entitled "The Show the Dead of Antietam" had the same impact on people in New York. Just 3 days after Antietam, in mid-September in 1862, photographer Alexander Gardner, an assistant and a driver, were sent to Maryland to photograph the dead men left on the battlefield. Gardner worked for Matthew Brady. Now, a lot of times you'll hear that Matthew Brady was a very successful society photographer and just chose, to hire people to go take pictures of dead guys. He just really didn't want to do that. That's not true at all. He maintained a studio and a gallery in New York City, but as soon as the war broke out, he also opened a studio in Washington, and he was determined to photograph the events of the war, from parades and inaugurations to battlefield chaos. Brady, however, was losing his sight. He was going blind. He hired several men to do the actual photographic work because he went alone, with the driver, to the Battle of First Bull Run. And when he got back, he realized that none of the plates he shot there were usable. Simply could not do the job himself. So after Antietam, Alexander Gardner brings back over 70 plates from the battlefield, and within 2 days, they have them printed, carefully wrapped, and sent to the Brady Gallery in New York. On October 20th, the gallery show, The Dead of Antietam, opened, and New York was stunned. Papers said It is as if the dead had been laid at our very doorsteps. So this is the first time that this kind of photography was ever used. So that's Alexander Gardner. And you see Brady at least has glasses on there, but he just couldn't do it. Okay, when I was writing this book, the movie War Horse had come out. I guess it was a Broadway play first and then came out as a movie. And we had been talking about the horses and other four-legged victims of combat that had served in a variety of wars. Well, two-legged, because I guess there were pigeons even up to now. But of the 1.5 million horses and mules that died in the Civil War, their aftermath was unfortunate. They were simply piled up and burned, creating a terrible stench that fouled the air for miles. But a few war horses of famous men got their own aftermath. Okay, I don't know if I guess I can do it. General Lee's Traveler, his bill is buried with his master at Washington and Lee Cemetery. Washington and Lee University. General Sheridan's Rienzi, of poetic fame, is stuffed and mounted in his own glass case at the Smithsonian. It's kind of a morbid look, but you know, he's there. Old Baldy, General Meade's war horse, is in the GAR Museum in Philadelphia. At least his head is. And when Chris and I were talking about things to include besides just bang, you're hurt, pow, you're dead, now what do we do with you? I felt that no book on the Civil War dead would be complete without mentioning those who died while performing the duties they were asked to do. Pull cannon, wagon, carry their riders into harm's way. They didn't choose a side, they never owned a slave. They followed orders and paid with their last full measure as well. 3 men, 3 amputations. This is a famous photograph. And a topic that unfortunately is just as current today as it was in the 1860s, amputation. The decision to amputate is one no doctor wants to make, but often the only way to save a life is to remove a limb that has been damaged beyond repair. The nature of projectiles in the Civil War, specifically the Minié ball, cannon shells, was such that the bone was mangled into small, splintered pieces rather than breaking cleanly. Nor were bullets likely to pass through and out of a person's body. Instead, they ricocheted around inside the victim, doing incomparable damage. Today we call those kinds of bullets cop killers. Amputation was used very frequently to save lives, if possible. Since the Civil War, the rate of amputation fell considerably due to changes in weaponry. Neither World War, nor Korea, nor Vietnam used ammunition similar to that used in the Civil War, but in the late 20th and 21st century, weaponry underwent another change. As military forces moved into areas where IEDs, improvised explosive devices, and handmade small bomb clusters were the weapons of choice, once again, bone-splintering injuries began to appear. Both soldiers and civilians who have been living victims of incendiary devices have often had to endure amputation. Much is improved, of course. Operations are much safer now. Palliative care is an art in itself. Prostheses have evolved from wooden legs and wooden arms used only for social gatherings due to the pain and the clumsiness of the device to the wearer. But nowadays, they have amazingly technical, almost bionic appliances that help their wearer regain his or her place once again in society. Most of the battlefields in the Civil War were fought on Southern soil, and for a man to contemplate his own mortality was awful enough. But to think of dying far from home and of his remains never being returned, well, that was pretty unthinkable. Embalming is a process by which the natural fluids in the body are replaced by a combination of chemicals although there was no specific formula in use during the time of the Civil War. Embalmers used everything, rubbing alcohol, whiskey, and arsenic blends of several varieties. And like ghouls, those embalmers followed the armies. A soldier could pay in advance for his body to be embalmed, if possible, and sent home. If embalming was not possible, or even if it was, special coffins were developed to contain human remains without overwhelming the surroundings with the stench of decay. Things got so bad that several railroads refused to carry coffins because of the smell, which had an unfortunate tendency to linger after the coffins had been removed. Finally, embalmers and coffin makers got better at their trades, and remains were returned in double coffins, lead-lined coffins, and metal coffins that had been welded shut. However, those whose bodies could not be embalmed and sent home were far more numerous than the lucky few. Most dead bodies were buried where they lay, sort of. The Army developed a policy of entrenching remains. It went like this. The bodies were lined up side by side in very shallow graves. The first one to be buried was moved to the top of the fellow next to him, and then the hole was deepened. The body was then dumped into that hole, and the dirt from the hole was used to cover the next body, and so on down the line. Pieces of wood about 2 feet long and a foot wide were used to identify the corpse, if possible. If not, the boards often said, Yankee soldier, Confederate soldier. Both ways were fast, but not very effective. Oh, I apologize. Another way to bury soldiers, especially if they had been exposed to the elements for a longer time, was to dig a pit and fill it with bodies and cover it. Both ways were fast, but not very effective. After the war, the national government made great efforts to find, disinter, and identify Union bodies. Rewards were offered for remains. The Veteran Volunteer Corps traveled to every possible battlefield looking for graves and remains. Land was bought on or near the battlefields, and the bodies were laid to rest in military funerals. This process began the creation of what we now know as national cemeteries. From Arlington to Gettysburg, from Fredericksburg to Chattanooga, the chain of American cemeteries runs across the land, honoring our war dead, now all the way to Monterey. Additionally, the South had its own story. There was resistance to burying blue and gray together in large cemeteries. So Southern graveyards tended to be smaller and more intimate. And additionally, each Southern state wanted to be responsible for its own troops. There was no push for a national organization encompassing a collection of Confederate soldiers. The one exception to this pattern is Hollywood Cemetery outside Richmond, Virginia. It existed before the war, and its proximity to the Confederate capital made it an obvious resting place for Southern elite like President Davis and his family. Many officers are buried there, and many groups of unidentified remains as well. Hollywood's a beautiful example of what was called a Victorian garden cemetery, has winding paths, small private spaces for contemplation and prayer. No one grave is exactly like another, yet all fit, flow together, the aesthetically lovely and the absurd, intertwined in death as perhaps never in life. This little Southern submarine, the H.L. Hunley, is included in the aftermath because it sort of stands in for all of those who were lost at sea and buried in watery graves. I didn't really know what to do about that since I felt like, well, we have a whole lot about land. We don't have anything about men who ended up in a watery grave. And the truly exciting part of the Hunley story is not exactly historical, and that happened all in the past, but current. When I was looking at the Hunley, I knocked over cups of coffee, getting up and cheering and laughing and being really excited because facial reconstruction, just like on shows like in the old days CSI and Bones, nowadays FBI, NCIS, have given the anthropologists who work on the skeletal remains the ability to put faces to the men who lost their lives. Amazingly enough, also DNA is finding the relatives of these sailors and giving them back their history, basically returning their lives to them. Just imagine if this could be done for all who have died in any war. There would never again be an unknown soldier or sailor. And if you go to the website for the H.L. Hunley, and just remind yourself, the last day of every month, check it out. Every month, there's some new discovery, some new, exciting, scientifically based, forward-thinking thing that's happened, including looking at the clothing that was on the skeletons and being able to reproduce that clothing exactly, finding out what actually killed them, since they didn't have a bunch of skeletons all, reaching up to get out of the sub. They were all sitting in their places. This Hunley was sort of rowed underwater, but all the men were sitting there and no one tried to get up. So whatever was that happened very quickly. It was completely fatal, and nobody saw it coming. And they found, by working with the oxidation, to get down to what was actually there that day inside the Hunley, doing analysis for metallic particles and finding out what gas it was that happened to be getting in and killing them. It's just, if you like that kind of thing, the Hunley is absolutely an ongoing treasure trove of current Civil War history. And finally, of course, we get to Andersonville. One of the final chapters in Aftermath is the story of the recovery of prisoner bodies at Andersonville, Georgia's notorious Confederate prison. Clara Barton, mostly known as a nurse in the Civil War, she wasn't really a nurse at all. She was a one-woman sanitary commission. She had really little nurses training or anything like that, as we think of her now as founder of the Red Cross. And if you think of what the Red Cross does, those are the kinds of all-encompassing things that even that Clara Barton did. She wasn't standing by one bedside nursing. She was nursing the entire Union Army and a good part of the Confederate Army if they ended up in the same hospital. She arrived, she was based in Washington, D.C., and arrived almost daily with wagons that were filled with supplies for what she referred to as her soldiers who had been in battles around the Washington area. She was headquartered in the city of Washington, where she ran the missing soldiers office from a little apartment above the store on 7th Street. I might have a picture of that. Nope, but this guy's coming up. Anyway, one day in the spring of 1865, a very tall man walked up the rickety steps to Miss Barton's abode. His name was Doran Satwater, and he had been released from Andersonville only a few months earlier. And he carried with him a list, a very important list. During his time at Andersonville, he volunteered to work in the dead house, identifying men who died in Andersonville and preparing them for burial. Lists of the dead were kept by the Confederates, but Atwater didn't trust the Confederate government to maintain those lists with any authority. He wasn't sure they would ever be given to the Union authorities, so the bodies of Andersonville would be properly identified. So he copied the lists and kept his version with him until he was released. Initially, he tried to interest the government in his information, but President Johnson, of course at that time, had his hands full, and Atwater was rebuffed. And he finally decided to take his list to Clara Barton. Best decision ever. Due to the efforts of the very tall Mr. Doran Satwater and the very tiny Miss Clara Barton, a government commission was sent to Andersonville, and the shock at what they found reverberated throughout the entire North with the same kind of intensity that the dead at Antietam had done. A lot happened after that, but what finally came of Atwater's and Barton's efforts was that the jumbled remains of Union men were sorted, identified if possible, and reburied with care, love, and dignity. If you followed this at all, you will know that it wasn't until a couple of years ago that they really felt the project was finalized, because they had done DNA testing whenever possible so they could identify these soldiers.
Oh, wow.
The Andersonville National Cemetery and Andersonville National Historic Park would never have come into existence. Those men would never have been identified without the joint efforts of Clara Barton and Doris Atwater. Well, the aftermath of battle finally became the aftermath of the war. Veterans went back to their lives, tried to go forward, some more successfully than others. Organizations such as the United Confederate Veterans and the Grand Army of the Republic provided some focus for the veterans, spawned support groups for sons and daughters, but time refused to stand still. Each year there were fewer and fewer men in attendance at the memorial events. Old men got older. By August 1956, former Union Private Albert Wilson was the last man standing. He was 109. In October of 1864, he was 17. He had enlisted in Company C, 1st Minnesota Volunteer Heavy Artillery. He, his drum, and his bugle served with the Army of the Tennessee under Major General George Thomas. Albert Wilson spent most of the summer of 1956 in St. Luke's Hospital in Duluth, Minnesota, with a recurring lung condition, finally passing away in the company of his loved ones on August 2nd. At his funeral, thousands turned out to honor this old soldier. Then President Dwight Eisenhower wrote his obituary for the New York Times, mentioning that this was the last link we, as Americans, had to both sides of the war between the states. Interest in the American Civil War does not appear to be slowing down. More books are published annually about the war than about any other conflict. Those publications help remind all of us that those who fought deserve to be remembered, Confederate or Union, officer or enlisted, identified or still unknown. This is what we do with all the bodies. What we do. We read about them. We remember their stories. We remember their sacrifice. We remember that they were ordinary people, just like us, trying their best to do their duty under extraordinary circumstances. They all look toward home. We welcome them back to rest in peace. Thank you. Questions and answers? Yes.
If you have a Civil War veteran in your line, I understand that you can order a headstone.
Yes.
How do you go about doing that?
Well, actually, this is I have a what I think is a really good story that goes with this. And of course, it stars Elmer Ellsworth. No, it really doesn't. But Elmer Ellsworth's aide-de-camp for the 11th New York Fire Zouaves was Jack Wilding, and he was a New York fireman, bred to the bone, Irish fireman, and he went to Bull Run, was the soldier that got back the colors of the 69th, for them after they were attacked by the Black Horse Cavalry. And then he went back to New York ostensibly to recruit, but actually he just got jobs working for Tammany Hall. And he was a baseball player, so he played baseball for Tammany Hall. And got caught throwing a game here and there, and finally became what would be the commissioner of baseball back in the day. But they were having a meeting as to whether or not baseball players could become professional. And he stood up and said, well, you all know my history, and you all know that I've thrown games. And the reason I've thrown games is so that everybody gets paid. If we had professional ball, none of this would happen. Our guys would get paid, they would come, they would do their jobs, and his vote was cast for, was the deciding vote cast for baseball to become professional. So, then, being Jack Wildy, he sort of goes on about his life, and in finding out about him, for ancestry, you first read that he lives in a nice section of the Ward 13, with his wife and his 2 kids, one of whom is named for the mayor of New York. And then in the next census, he's not living with his wife and kids anymore. And then a couple more censuses later, he's not living in such a nice section anymore. And finally, he dies, and he's buried in a pauper's grave. And I looked on find a grave, and sure enough, Jack Wildy's grave, absolutely nothing. So that was what started me finding out how in the world we can get Elmer Ellsworth's aide-de-camp, Jack Wildy, someone who definitely deserves a hero status. If for nothing else, I'm voting for baseball. We should get him a gravestone. Well, if you can prove, well, first of all, you call the Army or email the Army, and or the Veterans Affairs, and say you want the paperwork. They send you the paperwork. Paperwork is really easy to fill out: who he was, how he served, blah, blah, blah. But you have to have a photograph that shows that, in fact, this grave has been identified. You're not just putting it in your backyard. And there is no stone. Well, I got that far, and it turned out that the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn is where he's buried. The historian of Greenwood Cemetery had gotten Jack Wildy a headstone. And so my paperwork wasn't necessary anymore, and he now has a headstone. But all our plans to go have a ceremonial baseball game played with the reenactors who are New York Mutual ball players kind of fell to the wayside. I got cancer, and like a couple days later there was COVID, so one of my New Year's resolutions is to do something about that, go back there and celebrate Jack Wildy. But that's how you do it, and it's very simple. I was surprised that it came in the mail, or you can print it off. The questions weren't difficult or anything. But anyone who has served in for the United States can get a headstone. I do not know what they do. I know they're Confederate headstones, and that they all look alike. And they have that little thing on the top so that Yankees can't sit on their headstones. And I know all that. But I don't honestly know where they come from or how to.
This would be a union list, so.
Yes. Okay. It should be pretty easy to get. Yes?
Now, how about headstones where you can't read the name any longer? Are they going to be replaced? Or how's that work?
I actually know a lot about that one too. I think all I did is run around with dead people. I'm going to sit down. I can only stand so long. Okay, so the first thing you do is you get in touch with the cemetery where they're buried.
Right.
And you find out what that cemetery's policy is. And usually they will say, oh, well, and they will say, if you want to do something, go ahead. So then, again, you have to take pictorial evidence and pictorial evidence that this stone is no longer readable, and ask the Army or ask the Veterans Association how they want to handle it. Sometimes, depending on where it is, someone is sent out and just, they take the headstone and 2 weeks later it comes back, it looks good as new. Sometimes you get a new headstone. So it depends on what condition the headstone's in and where you are geographically. My husband and I have a headstone for a United States colored trooper, and he's buried in the IOOF cemetery in Hollister. And he's there all by himself, And one of our plans is to try to do something about that. And I haven't been there to see that headstone, but I sure would, now that you mention that, sure would like to see it look as good as possible, when I talk the reenactors into coming and, honoring our...
And who's it with right to the Army? How do we contact?
Just the Veterans Association.
Okay.
Yeah, you can go online and it pretty says headstones, what to do about it. It's very easy. I was really surprised. Of all the things, how many of you have been in the Army? The red tape. But for some reason, this website is very easy to navigate.
That's because it got simplified a few years ago.
Ah, good.
There was a lot of pushback because one of the bushes made it really difficult to the point where you had to have a verified descendant fill out the paperwork.
Oh.
That's the way there was a lot of pushback from that, and so a few years ago it got fixed so that you could apply more easily.
Well, it was certainly easy to apply, and thank you for telling me. I'm thinking, blog post.
If you look back, there were 3 different versions of the application. The one before 2000, the one that one of the Bushes changed it to, and then the new version are all different. So,
yeah, that's good to know, but I guarantee you, just it's been the last few years, like I say, it was maybe 3 years ago I was working on Wiley, and that's, we've all had, dealt with COVID since then, so I don't think much has changed. It was very easy at that point.
When you say headstone, you mean if it already has a Civil War headstone, but if it has any headstone?
If it has no headstone, they'll send you a Civil War headstone.
Okay, yeah, this one has a headstone, but it's not legible anymore. It's
Yeah.
100 and some years old, so.
Yeah, and like I say, depending on where it is, it's much easier, for instance, if you're talking about Arlington or, any place back east where you've got people who actually tend to those cemeteries, stonemasons and that, but, I don't know about what it would be like out here. So, yes, and then yes.
I don't think they had official dog tags in the
No.
Army.
They did not.
And so what, was it just like a voluntary thing people would do, or?
To identify you?
Yeah,
Before you went into battle. I think you pinned a note.
Well, it depended on,
Uniform.
yeah, but, and that's come under some question.
Yeah.
Because I had heard that also, and then it was like, well, great, you have it pinned to your sleeve and shoot your arm off,
Right,
There's his arm, so that didn't help much at all. Quite often, the, Civil War uniforms are very heavy as opposed to, uniforms now. And the coats have pockets on the inside, and the pants have pockets, and very often letters to and from their families would be inside, or they would simply be shot next to somebody who knew who they were and who went back after the battle to find them. But yes, it was real important. Once, had to go through all the political wrangling of whether or not it was worth it financially for the Congress of the United States to vote to pay for all these veterans, for their retirement, for their medical care, all of that. None of that existed. Once they got it through their thick heads that, well, yes it is, then things fell into place a lot a lot smoother. The cemeteries began to be put together. The generals who had fought at those battlefields were very instrumental in making sure that the men who had died under their command rested honorably, rested in peace. I'm sure you know that, Union soldiers got pensions finally, some of them after a while. I mean, they all got pensions eventually. Well, most of them got pensions. As soon as I say that, there'll be one that didn't. But Confederate soldiers had no such help at all. And one of the big issues with the Confederacy toward the end of the war was that so many men had been lost and left behind so many children and widows. And the bread riots in Richmond were because these women were trying to take care of their families. They'd lost their breadwinner. And no one was stepping forward to say, oh, you poor thing, here, let the Confederacy help take care of you. They had no money to take care of anybody. And once a lot of people, a lot of ladies, realized that, maybe some weren't ladies, they began to lose support for the war on the Confederate side. They were just really upset that they weren't able to, the Confederacy could not maintain a country. And that's just one real clear-cut example of not being able to take care of their war debt. Wasn't there one?
Well,
yes.
My question was basically identifying the dead with the technology in that day, basically just physically looking in their pockets kind of a thing. Any other techniques that they used to identify?
Yeah, they did teeth, look at teeth. Sometimes there was enough left to sort of make a visual identification, not of Garnett, we talked about him, but I guess they found his sword, Garnett's sword. But they just did the best they could, and Thomas is a real good example at the Chick Chat Cemetery, where he did not want the men there broken into units. He wanted them to be buried where they fell. So that's how they fell, that's how they fought, that's how they fell, that's how we're burying them. But in other circumstances where everybody from, say, the 11th New York was all buried together quickly at Bull Run, once they found where some were buried, then they could go through and unearth as many as they could. They knew who had come back, they knew who hadn't come back. It was a much easier job for the Union, too, because our paperwork was always done. There always were records that were kept. They didn't catch fire in Richmond at the end of the war or anything like that. They didn't run irregular units like the Confederates did in the Missouri, Kansas area. It was just, a whole different way of seeing the world and putting things together. And when we look at it now from a historian's point of view, you're really glad that that's the way it was, that we have so much intact information, which I suppose is at President Biden's house somewhere. Yes.
Yeah, one more question. Is there a record of what kind of wounds these people suffered? Is there a record?
Oh, yes, yes. If you go to Fold 3, which
Where?
Fold 3, that's same for the folds of the flag. Fold 3. How to explain this? First you have to get to Ancestry. You just pay the minimum to Ancestry. And then Ancestry starts, there's a worm, and you got to follow the worm. And pretty soon there's a couple more worms. And then you pay them another $10, and suddenly you get all these ads that were in the New York Times or the Richmond Inquirer or, wherever your relatives come from. And then there's Fold 3, which is all the Army records and, with the descriptions in the handwriting of the surgeons as to, when people were injured, where they were injured. what they tried to do, the disposition of the case, whether he lived or he died, or could no longer fight, it had to be mustered out, or could go back in. So once you start, those things really do fall into place. I have to say, I could not have done nearly what I was able to do for the Ellsworth book had it not been for the internet and for people who have done all of that work before me. I mean, yesterday, knowing I was coming here, we were going to go down Fort Tejon, I looked at the thing, the piece of paper, the copy of the photostatic, it's called, where there it says, Dr. Jonathan Letterman, posted to Fort Tejon, Lebec, California, and I thought, how can they not? How can they not? And I think how lucky I've been to be able to be trained as well at American Military University, which is also American Public University, which was, it's real hard to get a degree in military history in California. They'll give you a degree in tree hugging, they don't want, they ain't going to study war no more. So I thought, well, okay, and I tried everything from Berkeley and, to all the way down, or up, depending on where you put Berkeley. And I ended up taking my degree online at American Public University. At one point in my life, I was married to an Army guy, and he had finished his degree at American Military University, which as soon as the internet kind of came around, the Army, military, figured out a way for people who had joined out of high school, who were going to make the military their career, to finish a college degree or get an advanced degree. So no matter where you are in the world, through American Military University, you can take classes through the military. And that sounded pretty good to me, and it was one of the best experiences of my life. What professor do you have? Oh, gee, I've got 3 of his books, or that kind of thing. So, and I feel like I was trained very well in research methods, and certainly I also went back east, 5 times, but it's just, the whole experience was just tremendous. And if you really start looking, I'm no shill for Ancestry, but it's a great place to start. And those of you who know about it, I had to explain this to my husband when he started. For a while, there's nothing. And like 2 or 3 months will go by, 6 months will go by, nothing. And then all of a sudden there's just a dump of information. And, it's all over the place. And there'll be, another period, a dry period. And then there'll be a little bit, and then a dry period, and then another dump. And it's people out there who are working just like you are to find out this information and organize it. And you really begin to feel like you're part of a group, whether you're looking for your own ancestors, or in my case, I look up other people, not my own ancestors.
Got another question of the day.
Yes.
Yeah, this is kind of trivial, but you showed a photo of Amity, which cemetery was it now? I forget already. But there was a big statue there among the gravestones. Is that just a generic statue, or is it somebody?
No. A lot of the men in Andersonville came from 3 states, and they came from the Midwest, Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, or Ohio?
A lot of them probably
Michigan. Anyway, there's this group that basically was fighting in that area, captured, and then sent to Andersonville. And when they were getting ready to do the statue, they sort of said, well, should we do an old guy, who barely made it, or should we do a horrible, frightening statue of, one of those, living skeletons? There was a lot of discussion about it. And finally they decided that since it was Midwestern boys, they would find a model who looked like, came from Wisconsin, came from Ohio, came from Michigan. And they found several who were very, looked like one of their guys. and they created the statue, the image on his face, and even his hands and everything were done kind of in accordance with these models. There's a story about how they took plaster of Paris, and one guy had to put his hand in, and then the plaster of Paris hardened, you know, and then they ruined the cast of his hand, you know, getting it out. Finally, they had to do it front and back like that. So, he's sort of every soldier who was there that represented those states with their German ancestry and Irish ancestry and, you know, English ancestry. It was really, I thought it was a very, I don't know, sentimental read when I had read about it.
Thank you.
Sure. And there's no such thing as a trivial question, believe me. I've researched enough of them.
Yes, Clara Barton, I read an article just recently, it was really interesting about how she had to battle to get this. They were basically saying, you know, we don't need you, and then all of a sudden, we do need you. And it was President James Garfield
Yes.
who helped her start the Red Cross
Yes.
in America.
Yes,
And it
yeah.
was, thank goodness for him before he died, you know, so.
She's really interesting. You know, you kind of hear about the angel of the battlefield or the lady with the lamp. You start doing research on medical stuff. I don't want to say this disrespectfully, but pretty soon all those women kind of, you know, look the same after a while,
Right.
you know. And you've got the Confederate story on one side, which is they didn't want to have to do it because ladies didn't do that kind of work. So they sent their enslaved people to go work in the hospitals for them. And then the women in the North, who, I guess in New York City there might have been ladies, but those ladies opened their homes and gave sanitary fairs, right, you know, sanitary fundraisers right there in their own homes. The difference between the way women in the North dealt with the Civil War and women in the South dealt with it is a real challenging problem right now. A lot of women are writing about, a lot of female historians who write about women's history are writing about it, and nobody wants to be in that position of saying, oh, well, you know, those Southern women just didn't want to do it, or, well, what do you expect? Those Yankee women didn't have anything else to do. You know, want to like avoid that kind of thing at all. They want to look at why a woman on one side or the other would make the decisions she made. Of course, in the South, a lot of women refugeed, and in the North, they didn't have to do that. That's another real big difference in the way women handled things. I'm not a women's historian, so, but I review a lot of books, and I get to read a lot of other people's opinions, and that seems to be something that certainly the pot is being stirred on things like that, with a lot of women. In a lot of universities doing a lot of work. So it's exciting to be a historian now, especially for the Civil War. First of all, I'm sure you know that you can't turn on the news at any point in the day and not hear Lincoln quoted or a reference made to the Civil War. Somehow, somewhere, every day, there he is. And you know, I remember saying, oh, well, at least they haven't caned Sumner, you know, and then Nancy Pelosi's husband gets it. And, you know, I mean, it's just one thing after another after another. And we really have the opportunity as historians to point those things out to people, to make this war as relevant as it's ever been, I think, to deal with enslaved people and slavery itself, to deal with the lost cause, to, you know, there's just so many things in that war that now affect us today. And people, even if they're stumbling, you know, not every step is sure, it still seems to me that it's going to be Civil War historians who are right there front and center as a nation take sort of a collective look at ourselves and go forward and hopefully do better. So, yes.
And I have one more last question. And I heard a rumor that all the monuments for the South, all the soldiers are looking south. Is that true?
No. Although
Figured not.
the guy I used at the end there, he was, Appomattox was what he was called, and he was looking south because he was coming home. And of all the ones that he was in, right across from Washington.
Alexandria.
Exactly, thank you. There's too many A's there. He was looking home, and I saw him so many times, and it's not only that he's handsome, but I kept thinking, well, they can't get rid of him. He's just a foot soldier, and the war's over now, and he's got to walk home. But Appomattox went also, so I know no matter whether you consider yourself a Yankee or a Reb, you kind of have a soft spot in your heart for somebody on the other side. Mine would be Beauregard. It's like, well, we could put it in my garden. I just think it's interesting. We got so upset about it, and then you read a little bit about World War I and World War II in Europe, and realize how many of those monuments have totally disappeared. And this isn't anything new.
Well, I want to thank Meg for coming all the way from